Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be sort of giving this talk on what I've entitled A Longitudinal Study Investigating How Students' Perceptions of Teacher Fear Appeals Relate to Academic Outcomes. So yeah, just to give a bit of an overview really, because the research that I'm talking about and the data that I'm reporting on today is kind of from like a longitudinal project really, in which I've investigated, well, I've measured quite a lot of different student motivational constructs with a main focus on teacher fear appeals. I've had like lots of research questions really around how the different constructs that we've measured are related to each other, and also how they relate to achievement as well. And I've collected quite a lot of quantitative data, but also qualitative data as well from 10 and 11 students and GCSE maths teachers as well. And I've collected this data over 5 time points over 2 years. Unfortunately, this was a bit affected by the closure of schools, as lots of research has been, unfortunately. But yeah, so I still have got quite a lot of data though. And today I'm going to talk about 2 studies which have been based on this research project. So study 1, so this is about the longitudinal relationships between teacher fear appeals, student engagement and achievement. So just to kind of give a definition of teacher fear appeals, so these are kind of persuasive teacher messages that teachers might give to students in preparation for a high stakes test, where they highlight the consequences of success or failure, and also the actions required to achieve success or avoid failure. So an example of this could be, they might say to students, if you do not work hard, you will not pass your maths GCSE and will not go to college or sixth form. So they are designed to motivate students to work hard, to do well in exams. But we found that basically students evaluate these messages in different ways. And there are 3 types of ways that students can evaluate them. They can evaluate the teacher fear appeals in a challenging way, where they will focus on mastery and hope and excitement. This is a positive thing. Or they can evaluate them in a threatening way, where they kind of focus on loss, worry and anxiety. Or they might just feel that the message is actually completely irrelevant to them, and then they just feel like completely indifferent really, and doesn't really have any effect on them at all. So what determines how fear appeals are evaluated by students? So this is basically, there's 2 kind of determinants of how students evaluate fear appeals. One of them is it depends on how much the students value the outcomes. So the outcome here would be like passing their GCSE. And this is based on attainment value, so how much they value getting good marks on tests. And also utility value as well, so how much they value the utility of that subject outside of the classroom. And also the way they evaluate fear appeals also depends on how much confidence they have as well to achieve the outcome. So it depends on their self-efficacy, how much they believe that they're capable of learning the subject, and also their expectancy of success, so how much they believe they are capable of achieving the outcome, so doing well in the exam. So previous studies of secondary school students preparing for their GCSEs have shown that when students have high value and they have high confidence, they're more likely to report a challenge evaluation. So they might think, I know this exam is important, but I believe in my ability. So they approach it in a challenging way. If they have high value of the GCSE, for example, but low confidence, then they're more likely to arrive at a threat evaluation. So they might think, I know this exam is important, but I do not have the ability to pass it. So they feel that that's a threat to them. Or they might have very low value or very high confidence. So they might think, I do not need to listen to this because this exam is not important to me, or because I know that I will definitely pass. And in this case, they kind of think that the message is irrelevant to them, and they might disregard it completely. And also, every time a fear appeal is used in the classroom, it prompts students to kind of reflect on their how much they value the outcome and how much confidence they have as well. So every time that they kind of hear these teacher fear appeals, it kind of strengthens their threat and challenge evaluations. So you would expect like more frequent fear appeals to be related to stronger threat evaluations and also stronger challenge evaluations. And also this kind of has these two underlying determinants has links to educational psychology theories such as expectancy value theory and control value theory. So in keeping with such frameworks, it's been proposed that the relationships between teacher fear appeals and student motivation, engagement and achievement are actually mediated by the way that students evaluate the fear appeals. And also how much students engage in class as well is a good mediator as well, because student engagement is a proximal predictor of academic achievement. So because student engagement is quite a malleable construct and it's quite responsive to contextual factors, this is why it's quite logical to think that that might mediate the effects of fear appeal evaluations upon academic achievement as well. So this is kind of the proposed model that we have here. And also, theoretically speaking, we'd kind of expect a challenge evaluation to result in more adaptive outcomes. So, higher engagement, higher achievement, whereas a threat evaluation, we would expect that to be related to maladaptive outcomes, so lower engagement and lower achievement. And also these relationships are likely to be bidirectional as well. So there's probably feedback effects as well, within these different relationships as well. So previous research has supported many of these propositions. So students evaluating fear appeals as challenging have been found to have higher engagement and achievement, and those making threat evaluations have been found to have lower engagement and achievement. However, a lot of this existing research is quite limited. They have various methodological and analytical weaknesses, really. So, for example, sometimes there's no temporal separation between fear appeal evaluations and engagement. So the way that students evaluate fear appeals and their engagement are measured at the same time point. So we can't really sort of, investigate which one might come first. Also, some research hasn't looked at frequency of fear appeals, so how much students actually report hearing fear appeals from the teachers. And some research as well hasn't looked at measuring achievement, or it has measured achievement, but there's been other weaknesses, for example, measuring predictors and mediators at the same time point. So in the present study, we set out to address these weaknesses in a sample of GCSE students who were in year 10 at the start of the study. Specifically, the aim was to examine the indirect relationships from fear appeals to achievement, mediated by how the students evaluated the fear appeals and mediated by student engagement. And this was a two-wave longitudinal design. So basically, all of the variables that we measured at both time points. So we adopted a multi-level approach to analysis. So multi-level modelling basically takes into the account the fact that students are nested within classes. So it accounts for the influence of the class as opposed to the individual differences. So in multi-level modelling, we have two units of analysis. We have the class level, which is like the group, the effect of the group, and the student's individual level. So frequency of fear appeals is a classroom type variable anyway. The students have the same, students within the class have the same teacher that delivers the fear appeals. So to get a class measurement of frequency of fear appeals, we would average each student's report of that frequency score. But we can also measure the frequency of fear appeals at the level of the student as well. And this represents how an individual might differ from the rest of their class in the way that they report fear appeals. And the way that we interpret this is that we believe it's like an indicator of how much attention students actually pay to the fear appeals by the teacher. So when we look at it like that, we can then relate it to other student level variables, for example, how students self-report evaluating fear appeals and also how they self-report their engagement. So we did that in the study. We looked at the student level data and how the reports were related to each other. So we retested our hypotheses, which I'm going to get onto in the next slide, at both the student level and the class level using this multi-level approach. Today, I'm just going to report the student level results, but all of the data and results occurring due to the class level have been partialed out of this. So the hypotheses for this study was we had three. So frequency of fear appeals measured at time 1 will be positively related to challenge and threat evaluation reported at time 2. So we think that the more frequent fear appeals are experienced, the higher their challenge and the higher their threat evaluation at time 2 is likely to be. Also, we hypothesised that time 1 challenge evaluation will be positively related to student engagement at time 2, and time 1 threat evaluation will be negatively related to student engagement at time 2. So the higher the challenge evaluation, the higher the student engagement, and the higher the threat evaluation, the lower the student engagement. And finally, that time 2 student engagement will be positively related to their actual GCSE grade. And this is the hypothesized model that we had here. So the ovals are the variables that we measured. So obviously you can see that this is frequency of fear appeals and then challenge evaluation, threat evaluation and engagement. You can see that we measured them at time 1 and at time 2. And then later on we collected GCSE maths grade. The dotted lines just represent correlations between the same variable measured at 2 time points. And the thing to really kind of focus on here is the solid lines. These are kind of what we were hypothesizing. These are called paths in this kind of model. So we can see that hypothesis 1, H1, we were expecting fear appeals at frequency of fear appeals at time 1 to be related to challenge evaluation and threat evaluation at time 2. We were also expecting challenge evaluation at time 1 and threat evaluation at time 1 to be related to engagement at time 2. And then we also expected student engagement in class to be related to their actual GCSE grade at collected at the end there. And we also tested some indirect paths as well. So we expected fear appeals to be related to engagement via the way that they were evaluated. So the way we looked at that was looking at the H1 paths and the H2 paths. And we also looked at how fear appeal evaluations were related to GCSE grade via their engagement. So we looked at the paths here between H2 and then H3, see whether there was any mediation there with the middle variable. Okay, so onto the method. So this was a convenience sample of 1,530 students from 14 schools in the northwest of England. Students were in year 10 at the start at time 1, and then in year 11 at time 2. And we collected self-report data from the students in form time, and they completed the same questionnaires at both time points. And we measured, as I say, the same variables at both time points. We measured fear appeal frequency and evaluations, behavioural engagement. We collected their GCSE maths grade later on, and that data was available, which was actually teacher assessments because this was in the summer of 2020. And we also collected their previous year 9 maths grade, their gender, age and free school meal status. Okay, so this is just, I just thought I'd give a snapshot of the different questionnaires that we used. So this is what the questionnaire that we used to measure fear appeal frequency and fear appeal evaluation. So this questionnaire has 15 items. I've just screenshot 5 here, but you can see that number 1 assesses how much students perceive hearing fear appeals from their teachers. So how often does your maths teacher tell your class that unless you work hard, you will not pass your maths GCSE and be able to go to college or sixth form. That measures how frequent students believe that teachers give these fear appeals. And then there's 2 challenge items and 2 threat items here. So do you think that I need to work hard to pass GCSE maths? That would be challenge. Or do you think there's no point? I'm unlikely to pass GCSE maths no matter how hard I try. So that would be an item measuring threat. So there was another 10 items as well as those 5 there. And this was the questionnaire we used to measure behavioural engagement. So basically quite a basic measure of how much students believed that they engaged in class. So I try hard to do well in my GCSE maths class. I participate in the activities and tasks in my GCSE maths class. And all of the questionnaires that we used all have established reliability and validity from previous research, and we're also reliable with our data as well. So the analytical strategy that we used, so we conducted our analysis in N+8. We did some preliminary analysis where we checked the assumptions to check the data were suitable for the types of analysis that we wanted to conduct. Then we used multi-level confirmatory factor analysis to examine the measurement models, and basically this just tells us whether or not the way that we're trying to measure these variables, whether it's appropriate, whether it works well. And then we also tested how much the longitudinal measurement invariance, and that's basically testing to see if participants answer the questionnaires in the same way at both time points. Otherwise, that would be introducing a different sort of bias, really. And then we conducted multi-level structural equation modelling to test our main hypotheses, and we also controlled for Year 9 maths grade, gender, age, and free school meal status, just to sort of partial out and control for any effects that those variables might have on any of our variables or relationships between variables. And in a minute, when I come to the results, we'll see some statistics, and just to kind of give a bit of a overview of criteria, which kind of tells us that models are a good fit to the data, which is what we want. You can see some cutoff points there, and practically all of our models kind of meet these cutoff points, which is good. So I just thought I'd include those. So moving on to the measurement model. Well, first of all, students did report that their teachers used fair appeals sometimes. So on average, that was kind of, they were saying that their teachers did use fair appeals. So the measurement model fit the data quite well, so that we were fine to carry on with, looking at testing our main hypotheses. There was sufficient measurement invariance over time as well, so there was no bias in terms of how students were completing the questionnaires at both time points. So the multi-level structural equation model, this was what we used to actually test our main model that we'd hypothesized, and this showed an acceptable fit to the data as well. All of these statistics were fine, when we look back at the criteria for a good model fit. So that's good. So we proceeded to inspect our path coefficients. So this is kind of the main results, really, of what we found in this study. So if you remember, the dotted lines kind of just tell us how stable the variables were really over time. So students were kind of reporting challenge evaluations in a similar way. For example, that's quite a high positive correlation between those two. So that was all fine. The things really to look at here are the coloured lines, really. So the ones in red are the ones that we hypothesized. That's what we thought, the paths that we'd hypothesized that we'd find. And this blue one here was not really quite as expected. So we can see that time 1 frequency of fair appeal was positively related to time 2 challenge. So the more that students reported hearing fair appeals from the teachers, the higher their challenge evaluation was at time 2. However, frequency of fair appeals was not related to time 2 threat, which was quite unexpected. And then time 2 engagement was predicted by time 1 challenge. So the more that they were evaluating fair appeals as a challenge at time 1 was positively related to their engagement at time 2. But threat evaluation at time 1 was not related to time 2 engagement, which was quite unexpected as well. And GCSE maths grade was predicted by time 2 engagement, which was fully predicted. But also it was also directly predicted by time 2 threat as well, which we hadn't really anticipated, because we thought that engagement was probably going to mediate any effects of threat evaluation. But here we can see that threat is directly related to GCSE maths grade. So the more that students evaluated fair appeals in a threatening way, the worse their actual GCSE maths grade was. So the indirect paths as well that we had, we wanted to look at, two of them were significant. So fair appeals was related to engagement via challenge evaluation, but not threat evaluation. And challenge evaluation to GCSE grade was significant via engagement as well. So that kind of, we can see that here, that basically we have fair appeals to challenge and then challenge to engagement. Nothing really for threat there, though. and then challenge to engagement to GCSE grade. Okay, so when we relate these results to our hypotheses, so our first hypothesis that time 1 frequency of fear appeals will be positively related to time 2 challenge and threat evaluation was partially supported. It was related to challenge evaluation, but not threat evaluation. And one reason for this might be because students were attending to the fear appeals, so they were reporting higher fear appeals, perhaps out of like adaptive motivation or high motivation rather than a maladaptive thing, and that's why it wasn't related to threat. Time 2, hypothesis 2. So over time 1 challenge evaluation was positively related to time 2 student engagement. But time 1 threat evaluation was not related to engagement. And it's noteworthy that some research by Nicholson and Putwain found that across waves, threat negatively predicted emotional rather than behavioural engagement. So when we think that we've only measured behavioural engagement here, and our previous research has found that threat has evaluated only emotional engagement, we can see that there's obviously some links there. It might be that threat is more strongly related to the emotional components of engagement rather than, what they're actually doing in class, like their behaviour. And hypothesis 3, as expected, the more engaged they were in class at time 2, the higher their maths grade, their eventual GCSE maths grade was. So it's noteworthy as well that many of the effects that we had, kind of show quite small effect sizes, but this was to be expected really because we controlled for so many things in this analysis. It was a really robust analysis in the way that we control for lots of interrelationships between variables across time, within time and everything. So to find these effects do show that, they are quite meaningful, really. So when we look at kind of the main findings here, so how fear appeals relate to achievement, we can see that the more that students perceived like more frequent fear appeals was related to a higher challenge evaluation. So it's related to, feeling challenged by these fear appeals. That was then related to higher engagement in class. And that was then related to a higher eventual GCSE maths grade. And also a higher threat evaluation at time 2 actually resulted in a lower GCSE maths grade as well. Okay. So the limitations of this study, there's a few. So we only measured one form of engagement. As I said, there's obviously emotional engagement as well that we didn't look at here. There's also cognitive and psychological engagement, and also the disaffection as well. Some research recommends looking at disaffection as well as engagement. There was only 2 waves of data collection in this study as well. So this was sufficient to test indirect relations, but we were only able to measure them. We could only test them at one time. So if we had, and we had actually intended, as I alluded to before, to have a 3rd wave of data collection, but COVID obviously severely interrupted that. So we've only been able to obviously use the data from 2 waves of data. The GCSE grades in 2020 as well, were determined by teacher assessments rather than exams. So obviously it would have been perhaps more ideal if exams had been used as anticipated, but because fear appeals are not really just made in relation to exams, they're made in relation to the high stakes nature of tests. So, of the high stakes nature of the GCSE qualification, I should say. So it's not, we don't see that as a major kind of limitation. And also, obviously, this data relied on student reports of fear appeals and self-perceptions of fear appeal evaluations and engagements. Obviously, self-reports of things like fear appeals, the way that students evaluate evaluations and engagement is obviously a good way of kind of assessing private beliefs. It's probably the most accurate way. But it would be good if we could triangulate particularly measures of how often teachers might give fear appeals with other kinds of data, for example, teacher self-reports or peers, parents, is obviously good as well. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to study 2. So in this one, we used the same, very similar data set, but we just looked at the data from time 1. So we looked here at achievement emotions and how they might mediate the relationship between fear appeal evaluation and student engagement. So this links in nicely with what we just found really in study 1. So already there were gaps in the literature concerning the relationship between fear appeal evaluations and student engagement, and also some unexpected findings as well. So for instance, a study that we conducted where we employed a person-centered approach. So we found that students could actually simultaneously appraise fear appeals at both a high level of threat and a high level of challenge as well. So it isn't necessarily just one or the other. But when they did so, as well as experiencing high levels of behavioural engagement, they also reported high emotional disaffection as well. This was quite a confusing finding. So, we thought that perhaps focusing in a bit on the emotional side of things might help to disentangle some of these findings. Also a study that we conducted using a cross-legged panel design. We found that challenge evaluations prospectively predicted behavioural disaffection, but they weren't related to behavioural engagement or emotional engagement disaffection. That's similar to what we just found, that challenge evaluations were related to the behavioural side of things. But in this previous study, threat evaluations did not prospectively predict either behavioural engagement or disaffection, but they did predict both emotional engagement and disaffection. So again, it's kind of pointing to perhaps more of a link between threat evaluations and the emotional side of things. So I've linked it here with study 1 that I was just reporting on, how challenge evaluations prospectively predicted behavioural engagement, and threat evaluation did not prospectively predict behavioural engagement, but was directly related to achievement. So emotions may be a more proximal outcome when fear appeals are evaluated as a threat, perhaps. So we wanted to kind of focus in on that a little bit by measuring achievement emotions. So achievement emotions are student emotions that are linked to academic learning, classroom instruction, and achievement activities and outcomes. So they consist of affective, cognitive, motivational, and physiological components. And they can be categorized into 4 types. So positive activating emotions, so for example, enjoyment and hope. Positive deactivating, so relief, relaxation. Negative activating, so like anxiety and anger. And negative deactivating, so like hopelessness or boredom. So all of these emotions have been found to be quite frequent in an academic setting, and they've all been found as well to have differential effects on engagement and on academic performance as well. It's also important to kind of look at these discrete emotions as well and how they link with other academic variables. Research has confirmed that. So in this study, we kind of noted that previous research suggests that achievement emotions may play an important role in how fear appeal evaluations relate to behavioural engagement. And the research question was, do achievement emotions partially mediate the relations between threat and challenge evaluations of fear appeals and behavioural engagement? And we measured 4 emotions here, 2 positive activating emotions, enjoyment and hope, 1 negative activating emotion, anxiety, and 1 negative deactivating emotion, which was hopelessness. So just to go back to kind of what the figure that we looked at before, we're focusing in on this relationship here and proposing that achievement emotions might be here between these 2. So here is the mediational model that we tested for each of the 4 emotions. So we've got challenge evaluation and threat evaluation. So obviously this is how students evaluate fear appeals made by the teacher. And then we're proposing that, there's an achievement emotion here, and then that has the effect on behavioural engagement. Obviously, we expect challenge evaluation to be positively related to behavioural engagement and threat evaluation to be negatively related to behavioural engagement. So the hypotheses here, that challenge and threat evaluations will relate positively and negatively to behavioural engagement, respectively. Challenge evaluations will relate positively and threat appraisals negatively to the two positive emotions, enjoyment and hope. And then challenge evaluations will relate negatively and threat evaluations positively to the negative emotions of anxiety and hopelessness. We also expected enjoyment and hope to relate positively to engagement. So obviously higher levels of enjoyment and hope, higher engagement. But anxiety and hopelessness will relate negatively to engagement. So higher levels of anxiety and hopelessness should relate to lower engagement. And also that we were looking at whether or not achievement emotions might partially mediate the relationships between fear appeal evaluations and engagement. So whether or not, these achievement emotions are kind of the reason why fear appeal evaluations and engagement are actually related. So the method here, similar sample size. So this was just at time 1. So the students were in year 10. It was a cross-sectional design, so we only measured, we only used the data, I should say, from this one time point for this study. The measures in this study was fear appeal frequency and evaluations measured by the same questionnaire that I mentioned before. Achievement emotions, behavioural engagement measured by the same questionnaire, and then we also controlled in this analysis for year 9 maths grade and gender. So just to show you the achievement emotions questionnaire, you can see that students completed, a variety of items on each emotion. So I look forward to the GCSE maths exam. I worry whether I've studied enough for my GCSE maths exam. I think about my GCSE maths exam optimistically. My hopelessness robs me of all energy for the GCSE maths exam. So that top one will be measuring enjoyment, anxiety, hope, and hopelessness. So again, the analysis, we used M+8. We did similar kind of, preliminary analysis. We had 4 different models this time for the 4 different emotions. So we modelled all of those 4 separately. The fact that I mentioned before, we used multi-level modelling. We didn't use that in this analysis, but we actually accounted for statistically the fact that students were nested within classrooms. So we kind of partialed out that group influence there. So on to the results. So as I said, we used 4 models for each of the 4 emotions, and we can see here, if we look back to our criteria for a good model fit, that all of the models were fine, which was good. So we proceeded to look at the structural equation models. So first of all, we have enjoyment, and the data fit the model fit the data well. So you can see that the direction of the relationships were as predicted. So challenge appraisal was positively related to behavioural engagement. Threat appraisal was not actually related to behavioural engagement, which is similar to what we found previously. The more that students reported evaluating the fear appeal as a challenge, the more enjoyment they felt about the GCSE maths exam. The more threatened that they felt, the less enjoyment, which makes sense with what we hypothesized. And then the more enjoyment that students felt, the more that they reported behaving, engaging in class as well. And the mediation results showed that enjoyment partially mediated the relationship between challenge evaluation and behavioural engagement. So we have a partial mediation result there. So for hope, the findings were really similar to enjoyment, and the data the model fit the data well, identical to the results for enjoyment. Hope was a partial mediator of the relationship between challenge and behavioural engagement. Threat, again, was not related to behavioural engagement. It was negatively related to hope, so the more threatened they felt, the less hopeful they felt. It all makes sense. So for anxiety, the model fit statistics were acceptable, but unexpectedly we found that higher anxiety was related to higher behavioural engagement. And this only kind of occurred once threat appraisal was in the model. So we just we concluded that this was probably due to like statistical suppression, so something weird was going on, possibly to do with the fact that this was all from cross-sectional data. So we're hoping to kind of investigate that further with our, obviously the data collected later on. We're going to try and replicate these analyses using a prospective design using the data that we already have. So this was obviously problematic, so we didn't probe this further really. Challenge and anxiety were not statistically related. There was no point, looking at whether or not anxiety mediated that relationship either. And for hopelessness, the model fit the data well. Relationships were in the expected direction, except that both hopelessness and threat were not related to behavioural engagement. So mediation was not tested again because hopelessness was not related to engagement. So it's not going to mediate the results of any of the evaluations. So relating it back to the hypotheses. So the first one was partially supported. Challenge and engagement were significant. They remained significantly positively related when each of the 4 emotions were entered into the model. So this shows that relationship is robust. It was partially mediated by the positive emotions of enjoyment and hope. And this also kind of concurs with the results of study 1, really. But for threat, the positive emotions of enjoyment and hope fully mediated its relationship with engagement. So we can say that the positive emotions of enjoyment and hope accounted for the relationship between threat evaluation and engagement, which is what we'd kind of expected, really. There was a significant negative relationship between threat and engagement for the model that included anxiety, but not for the hopelessness model. And then moving on to hypothesis 2, this was fully supported. The higher the challenge evaluations were or appraisals were, the higher enjoyment and hope, and the higher the threat appraisals, the lower enjoyment and hope. And hypothesis 3 was only partially supported again. Threat was positively related to anxiety and hopelessness, and challenge was negatively related to hopelessness, but there was no relationship between challenge and anxiety. So that wasn't that straightforward. So enjoyment and hope were positively related to engagement. Anxiety was positively correlated to engagement, which was a statistical suppression effect, and hopelessness was not related to engagement at all, which was unexpected. And then finally, the mediation hypothesis. Enjoyment and hope partially mediated the relationship between challenge, evaluation, and engagement, and they fully mediated the relationship between threat appraisal and engagement. So that was kind of our main sort of hypothesis, really. However, anxiety and hopelessness did not mediate the effects of challenge or threat on enjoyment. On engagement. So it could be that these positive emotions might affect the fact that we didn't measure those in study 1. Might be the reason why threat evaluation was not related to behavioural engagement. So it could be indeed that we thought that threat is particularly related to the emotional side of things. Positive emotions might buffer against the negative effects of threat on engagement, perhaps. So key messages. So challenge evaluation and behavioural engagement seem to be robustly positively related. So when students evaluate fear appeals in a challenging way, they're likely to have higher behavioural engagement. Enjoyment and hope fully accounted for the relationship between threat evaluation and behavioural engagement. So these positive emotions might buffer against the negative effect of threat evaluations. Hopelessness was not related to behavioural engagement at all. So again, we can have a look at that, perhaps, with our other data from our other time points, and see whether there are any prospective relationships there. And the relationship between threat evaluation, anxiety, and engagement, again, needs probing further with longitudinal data. So limitations of this study were that obviously the cross-sectional design, so we can't really see which sort of variable might come first. Also, we didn't measure achievement here, so we can't relate it to how students actually did in their maths GCSE in the end. And again, data were self-reported as well, so obviously there could be social desirability biases or self-presentational concerns there as well. So going on to the educational implications of both of these studies, really. Obviously, fear appeals, and you can't really say that they're either like a negative thing or a positive thing, because the critical point is how students actually evaluate them. Students who evaluated fear appeals as a challenge did show greater behavioural engagement. So we know that that's obviously a good thing. Students who evaluated fear appeals as a threat showed lower achievement. This was not mediated by engagement, but it's possible that there might be some links there with emotions. So really, it would be good to try and promote a challenge evaluation, really, and there's a variety of ways, that we could, that teachers could try to do this in classrooms, for example, by trying to increase students' self-confidence and self-efficacy, perhaps by providing mastery and vicarious experiences, strategy-focused feedback, effort reinforcement, things like that. So really, teachers and educators kind of need to know these key things, that things like what teachers say to students does matter. Messages may not be interpreted as they were intended. Obviously, the reason why teachers, give these fear appeals is to motivate students. But as we can see, if those messages are evaluated in a threatening way, obviously it has adverse effects then. So the impact depends on, indeed, student evaluation. Obviously, we've found that value and confidence determine how students, evaluate fear appeals, whether they evaluate them in a threatening way or a challenging way. But there might be other variables as well that we can look at: student characteristics, how buoyant students are, their growth mindset, student-teacher relationship, and things like that. So we need to look into that further. And it's difficult to say what the optimal message is as well. The right kind of message will be different for different students. There are obviously other types of teacher messages, like efficacy appeals that focus on mastery, and that might be better for some students perhaps that are lacking in confidence rather than fear appeals. For those students who don't value education at all, then a completely different type of message is necessary. So it's really difficult to say. But yet, messages might be better directed to the individual rather than a whole class or a whole year group. And in terms of what I'm going to do basically with the data that I've collected, I'm going to continue to analyse all of this data. As I said before, try and replicate or repeat the cross-sectional analysis using longitudinal data now to see whether or not these relationships that we found that were occurring at just one time point, whether or not they're robust enough to kind of last over time, and to see perhaps what direction they're in, what variable, what might come first. Also, I've collected data on student-teacher relationships as well. So having a look at how all of these variables really that I've got data on at these different time points all relate to each other really. Obviously, we've theorised different reasons for different relationships. So I'm just going to continue to kind of probe into all of those. Also, we have a lot of demographic data which we can look at as well in relation to these constructs and how they relate. And we have qualitative interview data from students as well about their experiences of fear appeals in the classroom, and qualitative written data from teachers as well about their use of fear appeals, why they use fear appeals, and what effects they think they have. So I'm going to obviously have fun looking at all of those things. And just a couple of acknowledgements, obviously, to Dave. Obviously I've worked with Dave on the research that I've kind of talked about today, and lots of other research as well, and also to Gushar as well, who worked with us on these projects. And the funding that I received here was from the EdChill Research Investment Fund. The references. Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long.
Thanks, Laura. Perfect timing.
Oh, good.
Obviously, I've got a stack of questions, but that would be totally unfair. So we'll leave my questions till last, and invite Micah, Joanna, and Hannah to ask some questions if they have any.
I just wondered with the thank you anyway, Laura. That was really, really good, really informative. Thanks. I just wondered with the emotions, did you try to put them all in one model to start with, and what happened?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and it was just, well, you've worked with M+, don't you, as well? It just, he said no.
Oh.
Yeah, so I remember I spent ages trying to figure that out, and then I think I will probably go back to the drawing board, when I do look at the time 1 and time 2 data, and see whether or not I can get things to work. But definitely with this, the only way that it would really work was to look at the motions separately. Yeah, I mean, I think hope and enjoyment were quite highly correlated as well. So there's obviously quite a few different reasons why. And then obviously we had that statistical suppression effect of anxiety and threat as well. So I do think it was probably to do with the cross-sectional nature of it and high like collinearity perhaps. And so hopefully those kind of things might be a bit ironed out when I look at like the time 1 and time 2 data and relationships there instead.
Can I just jump in, Laura? Was that correlation between threat and
anxiety?
Was it threat and engagement in the SEM? Was that opposite to the direction of the correlation?
I think it was the threat and anxiety relationship was not significant in the correlations, and then when it was in the structural equation model, it said that anxiety was was positively related to engagement, but that was different to what the actual correlations before it was all put together were. So there was something going on when all of the variables were in the model together, which wasn't right, because obviously when they were just on their own relating with each other, it was a completely different set of results.
I was just wondering whether is this stuff coming out now about like polyregulation, like how people in the past, the literature said that, you know, you focus on one emotion and regulating that. Now people said in an emotional experience you can have like multiple emotions. So I was just thinking that, you know, some students might be enjoying the lesson, but they also might feel anxious as well. So I just thought, thought that would be really interesting to sort of see like if they're interacting and stuff like that. But
yeah, definitely. That is really interesting. And it does link into like the person-centered stuff that I've done in the past as well. You know, as I said before, we've found that students can evaluate fear appeals at a high level of threat as well as a high level of challenge. So yeah, it's completely possible that they might have those kind of competing emotions at the same time. So yeah, I really hope that M+ says yes when I try and merge those together again.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. I see Anna's got her hand up there.
Yeah, Laura, that was so interesting. Thank you for that. I was just going to ask about the statistical suppression effects, actually, because I was interested about what you meant by that. Because I guess, like, theoretically, you could appreciate that anxiety could lead to increased engagement. If you're feeling more anxious and stressed, then you might put more effort into it. But then you've just obviously explained that that wasn't found previously. So I just wondered what that statistical suppression means.
Yeah, and I wondered that myself and really looked into that at the time because I was really confused by it. But I think because obviously before they were all put together in the same model, they were showing completely different results. I think that that's indication of a suppression effect. Obviously, Dave is the statistics wizard, so he probably knows the minor details behind it. But I think that, yeah, when we kind of discussed this, I think at the time, Dave, and we kind of just put it down to the fact that it was like cross-sectional data, as I said before, and perhaps hopefully it will be sort of ironed out when we look at it prospectively. So I don't really know why it did that. Yeah, it confuses me as well, and I will continue to look into that. But if anyone has any brainwaves on that, please let me know.
Hannah, if you think about something simple like 3 variables, so you've got variable A, like a predictor, variable C, an outcome, and say like in the middle you've got a mediator. Let's say that mediator was a total mediator, then what you'd find is a relationship between A and C that was, you know, strong or, you know, medium, dropping to nothing when you put the mediator in, because the mediator is accounting for the relationship. So like the way to think about a suppressor is the opposite of that. So rather than reducing the size of the relationship, it actually amplifies that relationship. And the reason why it amplifies that relationship is due to really weird groups of covariance occurring between variables. So the way to identify what the cause of the suppression is, well, you can do this 2 ways. Is A, to build up models piece by piece, so just insert one variable at a time. So you can see that when you add variable, whatever it is, X, then the whole thing goes a bit wrong. Or you can start at the end point and then just take one variable out at a time. I don't think there's any more sophisticated way than doing it other than that. There's different causes of suppression, but they're all due to covariance between variables. When when they're occurring groups, it's not like usually not as simple as 3. It's usually when you get like sort of like 3, 4 or 5 variables that are all kind of related slightly. Like you think like a Venn diagram, like you've got that bit in the middle where they're all related.
Got that to look forward to, maybe, Hannah, your analysis.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, suppression's a real joy.
I did have another question if no one else has got one. And the study 1 where the increased threat was related to worst math grade, could that potentially be related to the fact that it was teacher reported grades rather than actual assessment, so that the sort of the teacher might have some sort of bias in how a student would have presented in terms of their anxiety or threat level in through the year, and that's kind of had an impact on the teacher reported grade and why that maybe had an impact. Just didn't know if is that been found in research before the pandemic, which was actual exam grades rather than teacher reported grade.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I've not really thought about it like that. Obviously, yeah, increased threat is usually related to lower achievement. Yeah, that's normally found anyway, isn't it? Obviously, this design is really obviously robust and everything. The way that we obviously control statistically for autoregressive relationships between all the variables and everything. So perhaps it's interesting to look at the previous research and see. I mean, that's always found that relationship, isn't it, Dave? That negative relationship. But as we say, obviously this time we used a robust analysis, so it is interesting whether or not that perhaps might have played a part. Definitely.
Interesting to think about how whether anything like this has played a part in teacher reported grade. On a sort of like a.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases they even though they were teacher assessments, I think sometimes they did take into account mock GCSE grades and things. So perhaps it's not just thoroughly, like what teachers kind of said they would have got, but obviously there's some aspect of their actual, grades that they received in mocks or whatever as well. But yeah, definitely really interesting point. Thank you.
Laura, we can talk about stuff in more detail maybe when you want to start looking at the emotion data, but something that might be worth bearing in mind, I don't know whether you've come across this, is what are they called now? It's like halfway, ESEM, it's like halfway in between a confirmatory factor analysis and an exploratory factor analysis.
Yeah.
So, when you were talking about the problems of putting multiple emotions together,
yeah,
I'm presuming there was a poor fit when you group them all together, and that could be because you've got lots of overlapping correlation. So let's take hope and hopelessness. Even though they're distinct emotions, you'll find cross-loadings on hope to hopelessness and on hopelessness to hope. And when you do a confirmatory factor analysis, obviously it'll constrain all of those cross-loaded items to be 0. So that will reduce the model fit because there's an accounted variance for. So what you can do in this ESEM, or what Marsh calls set ESEM, that's right. You can kind of group your indicators for, say, like hope together and group your indicators for hopelessness together. So they do remain like separate constructs, but you can also account for cross-loadings as well. And it will, if the problem of poor fit is due to cross-loading items, that will solve it.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting.
Thank you, Herbert Marsh.
Yeah, I'll definitely try that then. Yeah.
Okay. Shall I stop recording here? Because it's probably an error or so, isn't it? No, wrong button. Stop recording.